Welcome, folks. Welcome as you are joining. Just taking a moment to let you all arrive here from the waiting room. You will notice that we have some of the Zoom functions turned off today for the first part of our time together to make sure we've got some security around our Zoom space here. So if you can't see yourself, that is normal. That is normal for now, for the first part of our time together. And later, when we start to have our conversation, we will be giving you back some of your Zoom abilities. My name is Sarah Bowen. I'm co-founder and executive director of training at Compassion Consortium, which is a non-sectarian center that offers guidance and support for people who are interested in the intersection of animal ethics, religion, and spirituality. And I'm joined by Reverend Marshall Hammer today, who is taking over the tech from that gorgeous forest somewhere where you've managed to get good Wi-Fi. So we're going to be here steering today. The plan for today is to have a presentation for the first portion of being together, and then a conversation for the second half. My writing and teaching focus on how concepts of animal spiritualities and theologies influence anthrozoological relationships and conflicts, and also a lot on moral injury and moral distress in those of us who are concerned about, care for, or advocate for members of other species. And today's presentation is a deepening of my remarks during our Sacred Sendoff for Jane Goodall, which occurred on October 4th of this year, 2025, shortly after her death. It also contains research I explored for a paper that was delivered at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics annual scholar gathering in August of 2024. So I'm going to go pretty deep and give us a lot to chew on, and then we'll see how it lands for you, see what questions arise for you, see what other kind of insights you'd like to add to the conversation. So for the next 35 minutes, I'm going to focus on the cosmological viewpoint of Jane Goodall. So the way she combines scientific exploration and spiritual experience together in order to understand her, and I might add, and our world. And after that, we'll have time to see what comes up in the room. We'll close with a short blessing for Jane. So I have to confess that as an anthrozoologist, a chaplain, an interfaith clergy member, a scholar, I have a lot of different things that kind of form my own worldview. And so a little bit of sacredness comes into anything that I am offering or doing. And so we'll follow suit here. I'll pull on my Buddhist learnings today, which suggests that for the 7 weeks after a person's bodily death, the transition to an intermediate state between death and whatever next is referred to as the bardo, is a place where the deceased still has ties to our world. Their consciousness may be still aware or receptive in some subtle way, and so offering loving guidance, offering blessing, offering the merit of what we do together to the benefit of them, of the deceased, can help them move more peacefully, avoid confusion or fear during that transition, and possibly, the Buddhists tell us, reach liberation rather than being reborn into the cycle of suffering. So if that feels shiny for you, that's an interesting concept to look more into, the bardo. If not, it's at the end of our time together, and feel free to just observe instead of partake, or drop off at the end. I'll warn you before we do that for anyone that might feel uncomfortable. All right, shall we get going? Marshall, you ready? Okay, let's do it. So let's start with a bit of a whirlwind bio of Jane Goodall's public persona in really broad strokes, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the breadth of her work. We usually know Jane or knew Jane due to one type of her work or one facet. It's kind of like something where you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling, and there's more places that Jane showed up. In 1963, through a National Geographic cover story, Goodall became a well-known global figure, capturing the curiosity of audiences beyond the scientific community where she was located. 60 years since then, her pivotal primatology research in the forest reserve of what's now Tanzania, she was traveling 300 days a year before her passing, sharing a well-told and familiar narrative with audiences. If you've ever heard her speak, you may know that narrative. Her storytelling included a canon of anecdotes about her intuitive and unorthodox scientific methods you might know about, such as naming animals rather than numbering them, and identifying emotions alongside behaviors. She shared about her discovery that chimpanzees use tools, not just humans, so overturning a key tenet of human exceptionalism and human supremacy that has been since then further toppled by multiple scientists and looking at tool use in myriad species. In the 1980s, Goodall's message broadened to include advocacy, not only for chimpanzees, but also for habitats for the earth. She and her institute team developed community conservation programs to address poverty, to encourage sustainable livelihoods that decreased harm to animals. She launched Roots and Shoots, a compassion-driven environmental education program for children that now operates in over 60 countries. She won numerous awards. She became a UN messenger of peace. With each of these new programs and speaking tours, her global reach and public popularity has grown. Since her passing, the amount of eulogies and tributes has been phenomenal, almost unbelievable. And yet, when we understand the breadth of her work and how many people she touched, in many ways, it is believable. She even challenged Barbie's coveted shelf space. Anyone have one of these? If you don't, it's going to cost you about $400 to get one. But Jane showed up in pop culture as well as science and spiritual circles. Her expansion into spirituality is what I'm going to focus on. Her role as scientist and conservation advocate started to include talk about spirituality, talk about pro-environmental religious ethics. Her speaking tours and her book started to dial up these values, which were harder to quantify empirically, the values of reverence and wonder and hope. The latter became a defining phrase for her for 2.5 decades, hope through action. By sharing her own narrative of entangled science and spirituality, Goodall encouraged her audiences to immerse themselves in a deeper connection with this thing we call nature in order to protect all that it includes. In 2021, she won the Templeton Prize with a $1.3 million award for her work bridging science and spirituality. So this was even acknowledged by the spiritual fields. Goodall was then interviewed regularly about spirituality. People who I've met who know her personally told me she was deeply spiritual in everything she did. Yet, here's what's very, very interesting. If you tried to lay out a systematized animal theology for Goodall's thinking, you would have a difficult time finding one. Unlike many of the theologians we might think about, like Andrew Lindsay and others who have published books called Animal Theology and laying out the way that things come together for them, Goodall never did that. It's hardly surprising, as she wouldn't claim to be a theologian. In fact, apart from some church attendance and Bible reading as a child, a raving crush on her pastor as a young adult, and some theosophy classes in the 1960s, she had little focus on religious education in her life. Nevertheless, she's engaged in environmental ethics conversations with Pope Francis, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, Rabbi David Rosen, Patriarch Bartholomew I, and other notable religious leaders. So for my contribution to this, I tried to figure out, how do we create a constructive and systematic study on Jane's behalf? My process was to code over 1,600 pages of Goodall's books and independent book chapters, 600 pages of Dale Peterson's biography, which included her personal letters throughout her life, which were very, very interesting. I highly recommend reading those. 100 pages of interview transcripts, miscellaneous web pages, and I read each in their entirety for context and flow, pulling out different references to things I was interested, keywords like spiritual, spirituality, religion, religious, Christian, God, Jesus, spiritual power, great power, source of all energy, creator, good, evil, karma, truth, supernatural, prayer, magic, and mysticism. Words that might give me a glimpse into what she was thinking. I also read all of her work in locations that could loosely be categorized as nature to try to keep a field work atmosphere. And here's the fine print for this presentation is to tell you that Jane Goodall did not review this before I'm presenting it to you, nor can she now. And so I urge you to listen to my observations, draw your own conclusions about whether this study might be valuable in adding to animal theology discourse and looking at science and spirituality and their integration. I'm going to give you a broad overview. Anyone who wants to go a little deeper can reach out to me, and I would be happy to have a longer conversation. Goodall avoids a lot of theological language, but her spiritual beliefs fall somewhere in this intersection of panentheism, religious naturalism, and congregational Protestant Christian thought, with a heavy dose of deep green spirituality. So if any of those terms mean anything to you, those are terms that we use in the academy and academics to describe different ways of thinking, of spiritual thinking that intersect, many of them that intersect with spirituality. The threads of her belief are always entangled with her narrative speaking style. It focused on her life history and was always told in a linear progression. So when she was asked specific spiritual questions, she would even caution the interview to be patient. She would get to that in a bit. So there's this kind of linear progression to the story that was important to Jane. After I read this narrative over and over and over, I had the distinct feeling that her spiritual journey is almost like reading some sort of New Testament biblical narrative that she's created for herself, her own testament of spirituality. There's a chronology that was important for her to impart. What happened when that led to her spiritual view? And if you think about yourself and your own perhaps spiritual views, you might consider the same. It doesn't often just download, right? All of our beliefs, we pick them up time over time and start to try to figure out how they all work together. We're rarely systemized in the way that we think. But she has two distinct strings that show up if you start reading a lot of her work. The first is the potential for spirituality in chimpanzees, based on her observations of them. That's the top quote here. There's a strong spiritual energy at the waterfall. This is where the chimpanzees sometimes perform their waterfall displays. I'm going to show you the video of that. The second is her own feelings of spiritual experience or awakening. And you'll hear her offer this quote, something like this in the video as well, where she's saying, I struggled after the experience to recall it. The self was utterly absent. I and the chimpanzees, the earth, the trees, the air seemed to merge and to become one with the spirit power of life itself. If you understand anything about non-dual spirituality or any kind of the spiritual or religious paths that often with mysticism or other kinds of traditions that talk about oneness, talk about non-duality, this is what Jane is hinting at here. Rather than some sort of trinity, she has almost a quaternity. There's kind of four things going on here to make a one. Chimpanzees, the earth and the elements, and her, with the spirit power of life itself. I'm going to look at these two concepts a little deeper for you, for those of you who are interested. This piece of the chimpanzee water displays she started writing about in the 1960s. She talked about these ritualistic dances that occurred when chimpanzees encountered waterfalls or even sudden rainstorms. They swayed rhythmically, they threw rocks, branches, swung from vines, and also sometimes just sat quietly watching the water. She interpreted those expressions as awe and wonder, and that they might be similar to spiritual experiences of humans. Let's hear from Jane herself.
When the chimpanzees approach, they hear this roaring sound, and you see the hair stand a little on end, and then they move a bit quicker. And when they get here, they'll rhythmically sway, often upright, picking up big rocks and throwing them for maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes climbing up the vines at the side and swinging out into the spray. And they're right down in the water, which normally they avoid. Afterwards, you'll see them sitting on a rock, actually in the stream, looking up, watching the water with their eyes as it falls down, and then watching it going away. I can't help feeling that this waterfall display or dance is perhaps triggered by feelings of awe, wonder that we feel. The chimpanzee's brain is so like ours. They have emotions that are clearly similar to or the same as those that we call happiness, sadness, fear, despair, and so forth. Incredible intellectual abilities that we used to think unique to us. So why wouldn't they also have feelings of some kind of spirituality, which is really being amazed at things outside yourself? And it's the same at the start of heavy rain. I've seen it a couple of times when a sudden wind came roaring through the valley. And you know, maybe it's defying the elements, defying the rain. Maybe it's the same kind of amazement that they feel with a waterfall. I think chimpanzees are as spiritual as we are, but they can't analyze it, they don't talk about it, they can't describe what they feel. You get the feeling that it's all locked up inside them. And the only way they can express it is through this fantastic rhythmic dance.
So you see here Jane describing spirituality as a sense of awe about those things that are outside oneself. Her most detailed thinking on this topic appears in two multi-author collections. The first one is an entry titled Primate Spirituality, which is a few pages long, in the 2005 Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, edited by Braun Taylor. The second is also from a 2005, and it covers much of the same ground. It appears in a book called Spiritual Information, 100 Perspectives on Science and Religion, which was edited by Charles L. Harper Jr. And her chapter there is titled, Do Chimpanzees Have Souls? Possible Precursors of Religious Behavior in Animals. So here she starts to tackle the question of souls. In both of these chapters, Goodall's observations of chimpanzee spirituality are entwined with the stories of her own field work and the reception of it, behavioral observation of chimpanzees, her own feelings about God, and an ethical imperative that she believes humans have to better care for other creatures and the earth. She suggests that while chimpanzees show altruism and compassion, they also have a dark side that's capable of extreme brutality and a kind of primitive warfare. This is something she struggles in a lot of her writing to reconcile, that theodicy, this term of, kind of why is there suffering in the world, or what we might say, why do good things happen to bad, or why do bad things happen to good people? And she nets out, actually, it's very interesting, that only humans have the capacity to be evil, animals do not. Chimpanzees, she believes, possess a spark of spiritual power, which humans worship, which she might relate to a soul in humans. And she thinks that because it's named a soul in humans, it should be named a soul in other creatures and beings as well. She often hedges on the possibility that land features, though, such as rivers or mountains or elements, have souls, which is kind of interesting to think about. She suggests the waterfalls of Gombe are a magical spiritual place. So there's a placeness to her spirituality. Also, as you heard, that the feelings are generated by the elements. It activates awe and wonder. And this is kind of an interesting point I might quibble with in some of her writing, that chimpanzees cannot discuss their internal feelings. And so that's why they do these embodied actions. I wonder a lot about that. Is it that they cannot discuss this? Or is it that this is just a way of expressing a feeling that is hard to discuss, for example? Many of the times we try to talk about our own spiritual experiences, we find we lack the words to do so. She suggests that it's unlikely that animals other than humans are aware of their souls, though, or concerned about the existence of God. For her, this is more of a, kind of response that comes from within. So it leads to some interesting questions. If they're experiencing spirituality and they aren't concerned about the existence of God, who or what is the chimp's relationship with? Is there God at all in here? Is this spirituality or is this an emotional response that's being named as spirituality? Well, some people have picked up some of those threads and brought some challenges. The first challenge has been that whether what Goodall saw is typical. Like, do all the chimpanzees do this? Is this repeatable, or is this just at this one place that you saw, Jane? However, it has been shown as repeatable. There have been other reports that have shown other chimpanzees doing these types of behaviors. But the meaning making of those experiences is still up for scrutiny. What do they mean? In science forward conversations, animal spirituality faces similar challenges as animal emotion. Is the meaning maker what the human is putting on it? Is it anecdotal? Is it widespread behavior? Is the search for animal capacities like emotion or spirituality sentimental? Is it wishful thinking? Is it anthropomorphizing? Goodall's interpretation of waterfall displays have taken some hard critique. William C. McGrew, who's also a primatologist who's been studying wild chimpanzees since 1972, notes that while these displays may be a ritual of respect or abnegation to the god of water, they might just be chimpanzees trying to get their pulse going in excitement. Might just be bravado. Others have wondered whether the presence of awe is not related to theological or spiritual concepts at all, but that there's an evolutionary function of awe, which is adaptive for species, which helps encourage helps encourage social cooperation, reflective processing, a way to experience the fluidity of time, and even a mating strategy. I don't have time to go deeper, especially on that last point today, but it's worth taking a look at. The takeaway I want to insert here is that awe and wonder are not necessarily spiritual concepts. A number of people have used Goodall's waterfall displays to try to kind of further elaborate on whether this is spirituality and whether spirituality for animals might be even more complex than Goodall was talking about. They've developed really useful thinking frameworks for spiritual experiences in other than humans. Shown here and worth a read are Paul Cunningham's work, The Case for Animal Spirituality, which is in 2 pieces, and Taya Brooks Preback's entire book, Enter the Animal, which looks at grief and spirituality in a number of species. Another line of questioning that's come up around animal spirituality is a very debated point in human spirituality is too. What's the relationship between spirituality and religion? While some people think these are separate concepts, we often find spirituality within religion as well as outside of. So some scholars have added significant contributions suggesting that chimpanzees and other animals may not only be spiritual, in some cases, they may be displaying religious behavior. So James Herod offers a trans-species definition of religion. Donovan Schaefer offers an embodied religion. And there's also a suggestion that the biology and neurology of why religion developed and why it persists might be important here. I think that Herod's piece is particularly important because he strips away all the things we might think of humanness, like sacred text or having to be in a church, and looks at the fundamental building blocks for religion as it developed, as it sprung up among peoples. Animal spirituality and religion are not merely topics for academics, though. There's a lot of musing about chimpanzee spirituality that hit public media as well. And the proliferation of this public curiosity about the spiritual lives of animals has created so many definitions and flexible expressions. Some of these consider spiritual connections are only about animals who die and connections to them in spirits. Others suggest that animal spirituality is something that animals themselves have. And some suggest, as you see in the book on the left here, that animals are a tool for us to further broaden and develop our own spirituality. So the word spirituality has become incredibly complicated when describing the possibilities for other species. Of course, devoutly religious people might find Goodall's merging of science and spirituality to be problematic. Many have critiqued this. Biblical Christian physician and apologist Paul Katupali of the nonprofit God and Science Foundation Incorporated, for example, suggests that Goodall's beliefs expose her as a pagan, stating her work is great, but her worldview is a dangerous falsehood. The last point I'd like to make on this is that there's an interesting trail that has begun to happen for people considering spirituality and how it might help in the advocacy of animals. For example, spirituality was cited as a chimpanzee capability in a legal argument concerning 7 chimpanzees who are currently imprisoned in a Michigan roadside zoo, suggesting that their imprisonment infringed on their capacity for and their need to express spirituality. And you can see the link up here on the screen if you're watching in the future or if you are here, in case you are interested in some of the potential for this concept in the law. Ginny Makita, who is involved here with us at the Compassion Consortium, was the local legal representative on that case and keeping us posted on developments. Here's a little more on the exact wording and Jane Goodall's contribution to this case. If you'd like to go further, again, take a look at the PDF link. So in my last few minutes of talking before we start a conversation, I'd like to touch on the second line of Goodall's spiritual thinking, her own personal spirituality. I think Goodall's contribution here is important because her story of her personal spirituality may reach people who resist concepts that include the term theology in them or religion in them, out of the erroneous belief that theology necessitates a belief in God and a Christian version of God at that. Her unsystematized and anecdotal personal experiences of spiritual connections in nature and to animals may resonate deeply with unaffiliated people. For one example, a 2023 survey of Americans by Pew Research Center suggested that 7 in 10 adults describe themselves as spiritual in some way, with 22% identifying as spiritual but not religious. So the 7 in 10 consider people who consider themselves religious. Spiritual but not religious is an identifier which typically includes people who are resistant to arguments that include religious terminology or beliefs. 26% of those surveyed stated that spending time in nature is the way they connect with their inner or true self, with others, or with something greater than themselves. And perhaps most interestingly, for those of us interested in animals, people who identify as spiritual but not religious were 26% more likely to believe that animals can have spirits than people who identified as both religious and spiritual in the survey. This may explain why many non-religious but spiritual identifying people are drawn to Goodall's books and spiritual interviews. But I still haven't exactly explained what Goodall believes. Her personal spirituality relies on her own narrative, peppered with stories from her grandmother, Trevor Davies, an influential preacher who she had a strong and lasting crush on as a young woman, her time in Gombe with the chimpanzees, and a 1977 experience in Notre Dame at a time of familial upheaval and her divorce. Those four influences created this narrative approach to her spirituality founded on Christian underpinnings and peppered with a few interfaith references asserting the commonality of compassion and divinity within the world's religious traditions. I suggest that what Goodall has constructed over her time is a system of interspecies theoethics. Within the paper that I wrote on this topic, I use a constructivist learning theory and systematized theology to separate her spiritual beliefs from her narrative stories and organize them into a single resource, which is entirely too deep for us to go today. But she included and kept deepening on this within her books as she progressed from those initial narratives and reflections. If you look at her books starting in 2005, 2009, 2014, she started to write more deeply on how spirituality should impact our ethics towards animals, resulting in the Book of Hope, which most people that I speak to who know Jane have a copy of on their bookshelf, which doubled the sales of her original spiritual journey. It was promoted during the pandemic. Oh, excuse me. That was promoted during the pandemic after this one. A key and often overlooked insight is Goodall's reconciliation of Darwinian evolution with the biblical Genesis accounts, which she goes through in the 1999 version, A Reason for Hope. You'll see some of the core ideas here on the slide. That God created matter and then matter evolved. That only humans have potential for the evil. That cultural speciation crippled human moral and spiritual growth, that good will ultimately overcome evil. She has a personal relationship with Jesus, but she doesn't want to talk about it with other people. It's personal. Karma and reincarnation are possible because God gives us multiple chances, she says. And she believes in free will, but also that some people are called as messengers or specific purposes. She thinks that humans can participate in self-sacrifice, but not animals. And that's interesting to think about when we think about the ideas of animals sacrificing themselves for humans. And she believes that humans have the potential for redemption, but not necessarily animals. Regardless of whether one believes in God, she thinks there's a responsibility to put things right and to heal the planet that we have desecrated. Her most systematized thinking appears in the 2004 book with Mark Beckoff, The 10 Trust, which is an alternative to the 10 Commandments in some way, a set of moral imperatives for how we should have relationships with animals. About 10 years after that, and most of you may not know this, she actually put out a prayer book for world peace. You can see some of the text here on the slide. The opening line actually kind of appropriates Apostle Paul from Acts 17:28, explaining the nature of God and humanity's relationship to God, with her substitution of great spiritual power for God, which is a way that she reconciles that. So in conclusion, There's no doubt that Jane Goodall's work has been beneficial to our understanding and study of chimpanzees and of other species. And it's undeniable that her influence reverberates, inspiring people to combine scientific knowledge with spirituality. I see her impact in my students in our animal chaplaincy program at Compassion Consortium and on people that I talk to about this work. I observe the buzz about wherever she used to show up, the parliament of the world's religions, and now interesting places as her memories last and proliferate where she cannot go on her speaking tours. At the same time, I acknowledge that the impact of Jane Goodall's expansion into spirituality is not easy to quantify beyond buzz. Are people challenging and changing their actions? New research detailing the problems of hope-based approaches to environmental crises give me pause. Having hope doesn't necessarily mean that people change. Are we looking at the potential for hope washing? Perhaps an intriguing follow-up for some other time when I have more time to write. So, folks, and hello, future people watching us on YouTube or on the replay who are not able to be here. Let's talk. I welcome your questions, your insights, what's coming up for you around this topic. I like to use the textures of what feels shiny, what feels prickly, what are the things that stand out for you. And we'll have some time to talk, and then we'll close, as I said, with a few sacred words. Marshall's going to give you all the ability now to turn on your video if you'd like to be seen. I see some faces that I know up there. Hello, folks. She's also going to be able to moderate here people who have a question or would like to add some sort of insight. So by now, most of us know how to use how to raise our Zoom hand. But if you don't, you can go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the React button, often has a heart on it, and then click on Raise Hand. If you don't want to raise your hand and speak into the room with me, you can also feel free to toss something into the chat and I can read it into the room and perhaps respond, or someone else might like to. What's on your mind? Or are you still full and thinking? Okay, I'm seeing a regular hand. So Jill, I see your hand. So Marshall, could you bring Jill on up here with me? And also give Jill the ability to unmute herself.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi, Jill.
Hi. I've loved Jane Goodall, and I love her more now that she's gone, and I want to just take in everything that she has to offer. And I appreciate this spiritual versus religious perspective of Jane Goodall. And what I find interesting is that if Jane has brought to the forefront any possibility that the chimpanzees had a spirituality or religion, and the interesting parts around the waterfall and the rain, I imagine it would scare most people who don't see the humanity in animals and the spirituality and treat them as only meat and a commodity. So I wonder what kind of pushback she would have gotten for that very reason, that she's assigning chimpanzees the ability to be spiritual as humans are.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Jill. And a point of clarification too, that Jane actually, she identified as spiritual and as Christian within her writing, which is kind of interesting. A lot of people who pick up her reading are in that spiritual but not religious category. Yeah, that's exactly the pushback that happens. And it's what we've seen with every capacity or capability that we find that animals have. So we go back to 1963 and the idea that that animals use tools, right? Like, and so people push back, no, no, no. Now we see corvids doing amazing things with sticks, and there's so many animals using tools. So it's the same kind of barrier. But what's interesting to me, as someone who does a lot of activism and advocacy, is the idea that at a certain point, when we get to a saturation point in literature, then it becomes harder to deny things. And also, what we learn, with time and with more conversations around these things, then becomes widely acknowledged. So the idea now that animals use tools is widely acknowledged. Now we're 80 years past that observation. We're an entire lifetime past that observation. So then the idea that animals, had empathy, uh, uh, had understood fairness. I think of Franz de Waal's work around fairness and the ideas of morals in animals, which also rubs people sometimes wrong. We're the moral animal, but his experiments suggest that's not the case. So each one of these, we keep moving the line this way, right? We just keep saying, wait, perhaps the capacity for this, for this, for this, for this. At the same time, I think it's important that we don't generalize across all species. So we have to look at species specific things, right? So a chimpanzee is using a tool. Is an earthworm using a tool? Not in the same way, not using a stick. So, understanding the species specific. I think that spirituality has the potential at some point for becoming widely accepted. Is it now? Not so much. Yeah, let's let Jill unmute here again. Yeah, it's not so much now,
Right.
but I think increasingly so. I think increasingly so. So she's been talking about this for, 2 decades. And so I see more and more when we were at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and I'll wrap up here and see what your response might be. But when we were there in Chicago, I think, was that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, right after the pandemic, we had, I think, close to 35 presentations on animals and religion.
Great.
I'm going to the American Academy of Religion, so the academic conference for theologians in the U.S. and academics in Boston in a week. And there's an entire chapter there called Animals and Religion. There's also an entire chapter of people in the Society for Biblical Literature, that animals and religion is interfaith, right? So across all sorts of traditions with tons of presentations. So there are these conversations happening. They're happening increasingly in academia. Does that mean the person on the street necessarily changes their behavior? I don't know. I have the same questions about myself sometimes and some of the behaviors I do that I would like to change. So I think it adds yet another tool in our toolbox for having this conversation, particularly in religious and spiritual communities. The work of the Interfaith Vegan Coalition, the work we're doing at the Compassion Consortium, the Animal Interfaith Alliance in Europe. There's a lot of people involved in this conversation. So it's not just, 6 people. Does that
Right.
does that help provide any
Yes, it
any
does.
hope?
Yes. And it's another stepping stone toward having the people like the Non-Human Animal Rights Project and
Right.
others, give rights and allow animals to be rehomed where they should be in the wild. Right.
Exactly. And that's the case that is in Michigan. It's the Non-Human Rights Project that Ginny's been working with them on. Uh,
Wonderful.
didn't exactly get what we were all hoping for 3 or 4 weeks ago in that, but it is a stepping stone again towards these things. So I look at it as
Yes.
another tool for advocacy, and also something we can use in our personal lives. This
Mhm.
this view deeply impacts my relationship with my cats and the squirrels in our yard. Deeply impacts that, deeply underscores my commitment not to eat animals, not to wear animals, things like that as well,
Okay.
considering kind of the spiritual pieces here.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming on up with some thoughts. I think next is Linda. Hi, Linda. And let's see if we
Sorry,
can get you
it took me a
unmuted. Hey, there
minute
you are.
to get through that. Okay.
Hi there.
First of all, that was magnificent as always. It gave me so much I have to go read now and think about and all that. So thank you. Have you noticed anywhere where Jane has distinguished from individual animal to individual animal? I loved your point about species to species, but just like I would call some humans much more spiritual or religious than others, did she notice differences within the chimpanzees, or has she never talked about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Linda. And I would like to go back and read a couple of the pieces specifically with that eye. It is interesting off the top of my head. What I'm recalling is it was important for her to have, individual when she was studying the chimpanzees, they had individual names, right? That was one of the things that was important for her to do. And we all know about David Graybeard and different names she had for animals. When she talks about them in the spiritual experience, as I recall, it's often collective. So if you remember that one quote that I showed up, it was I and the chimpanzees and the earth and the et cetera, et cetera. So it's this idea of the oneness of the experience that's happening. And that raises a lot of questions for me. In sometimes we can have this experience of oneness, and are all the other beings we're including in that experience of oneness having the same experience we are? I don't know for sure. So I think it raises a really important question. I think that if she was asked, she would probably say, yeah, there's a different potential for each animal just because her her point, her work is based on this idea of the uniqueness of individuals and seeing them as, names, as personalities, not as numbers. But I do think we tend to conflate in academic literature to try to prove for the species rather than prove for an individual animal. Yeah. How does that land?
Sorry, I had to unmute again. It does land. I think anyone who's had, for instance, rescued many dogs would say that some are more spiritual than others. I could go through my dogs, and I don't know why I say this, but I could distinguish between them. So it's something to look
Oh,
into more, think
you
about.
know,
I've never really thought about it till tonight.
yeah, it's a
So
good question, Linda, too, because how are we observing spirituality? So, for example, if I see someone who is straight up in Baptist praise through my left eye, and I see someone who through my right eye who's sitting zazen on a cushion. And if I don't know they're sitting zazen, let's just say they're sitting on the floor. Do I know that they're in deep meditation or not? Versus, what I'm seeing in a more expressive type of spirituality. Sometimes there's this idea that spirituality is quiet and spirituality is soft and spirituality is mindful and it's about being calm. And one of the things that I've learned through all of my interfaith studies is that that's not always the case. Be loud. You, drum beating, spirituality, not quiet. So the way that we're looking at those expressions, and that is one of the interesting things when you look at these chimpanzees throwing rocks. Are any of us throwing rocks as our spiritual path? I don't know. That's an interesting question too. Are there humans who we see, rock throwing? I don't know.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would look at my dogs. Some are more able to anticipate death or seem to have some kind of connection with the spirit world, but we could go on about that for many hours.
So that's the
I'll
other
quit.
piece. Yeah, well that's the other piece. So one of the things that often gets entangled here is the idea of spirituality, spirit world. They're combined for some people, particularly people who are in shamanistic, in Shinto paths, in different type of more animist or panentheist type of things. And sometimes spirituality has nothing to do with a spirit world. It's more a connection to God or a connection to universe or a connection to deep inside. So that's the point that I was trying to make earlier is we can't even define spirituality for humans. They got 150 books, perhaps, just on that topic. So then trying to say, okay, well, now here's this. Now it might be a little easier to define fairness or morals than it is to define spirituality. Because the idea of, this is bad or this is good, although that's so slippery, right? This as an ethicist. But it's easier to observe than how are you describing spirituality and what is it? It's often the ineffable. So how do you even describe it? Yeah. So I will go back and I will read. I think particularly what would be useful on your original point, Linda, to go back and read would be the piece from the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature from 2005 that Bron Taylor edited there. And then the piece of Do Chimpanzees Have Souls? Possible Precursors of Religious Behavior in Animals. I think those two early pieces would probably be the most telling. She interweaves herself in those, but she's also trying to make the case hard because that's when she's starting to make that. So let's read it and report back to each other. Sounds good. All right. I had one other question that came to me in the chat. So I will address that here. And if anyone wants to get a hand up or get something in the chat, either to me or to the main chat. I'm not sure if the main chat is open. Yeah, it is, Marshall. Okay, great. So there was a question about the books in 2014, Seeds of Hope and the Book of Hope. And what are their messages and how do they differ? And that is a great question because I didn't have a chance to go through every single one of these books and talk about them. So Seeds of Hope is the one where she is really looking at the importance of plants in our world. She's looking at the roles of plants in ecosystem, in human life, in animal life. She also starts to make, this is around the time where Jane starts to adapt the way that she's eating and the way that she's looking at use of animals from a theological and from an ethical perspective. So there's this kind of piece where when this starts to deepen for Jane, just like for many of us, when we start to look at all these different kind of capacities or capabilities, we might do something where we stop wearing fur or I could never afford fur to start off with, but the people who could afford fur, might stop wearing fur or stop, buying down coats or become vegetarian or vegan or those type of things. So as Jane is, kind of broadening out from the chimpanzees, she starts to make more of those observations and things start to click in her head, leading to personal changes that she's making. So Seeds of Hope is that piece where she starts to look at agriculture and the impact of agriculture on nature. And the impact of agriculture on nature cannot be understated. We use the majority of this planet now to raise livestock or to raise food to feed to livestock, which is a pretty inefficient process for feeding the planet. So that's the place that she's going in Seeds of Hope. Seeds of Hope is also a controversial book. There were some suggestions that parts of it were plagiarized or parts of it weren't given in the way that they weren't given the correct attribution. So that there was a little controversy around Seeds of Hope. The Book of Hope is the follow-up to, and I know I was lost my thread there for a second. Reason for Hope, 1999, is her original, like her story. If you started telling your story, that's what she does in 1999, is does a spiritual journey, Reason for Hope. And then 2014, so 15 years later, the Book of Hope is her follow-up to that original book. And that's where she starts to talk about what other people can do. She's trying to inspire other people beyond herself. There is an interesting prickly thing that Jane does for me, where she is very interested in what she calls the amazing human intellect. So one of the things that Jane held her hope on was that we could think ourselves out of the problems that we have. Now, this makes sense. Jane's a scientist at heart. So the idea of thinking ourselves out of problems makes a lot of sense. And that's what she's referring to as the amazing human intellect, which gives her hope. For me, there becomes a little sliding there of, us amazing animals, us amazing humans. That some people could kind of set up a case of human supremacy or on top of that. She's not doing that, to be clear. Jane's not doing that. But the text is a little slippery for me. The other things that give her hope, she has 4 reasons in that book for what give her hope. The second is it's the amazing human intellect. We can think ourselves out of this. The resilience of nature. So nature has the ability to heal. The power of young people. For Jane, the idea was some of us who are older aren't going to make the changes or be capable of making the changes that we need to, and we have to invest in youth. That's the entire purpose of the Roots and Shoots program, which is now in 60 or so countries, is help the kids. And we're not talking about just the kids where I live. We're talking about kids all around the world to be able to put in sustainable ways of eating, ways of working with nature that are less exploitive and less extractive, different ways where we're having children learn at early ages that they aren't socialized into these systems of dominion and carnism and all of those kind of things that many of us were just taught, what was normal, what was normal, what was natural. So she has a lot of faith in the power of young people. And the last of her 4 reasons for hope includes a word that Sarah cannot pronounce. So she will stumble over it. I'm just warning you all that. The indomitable human, oh, I did it. The indomitable human spirit. So she believes that we can think our way out of it because we have this strong, strong spirit. So I hope that was a question from Phil. I hope that helped you understand those books. I think all of these books are worth a read if you don't have them. The one that I would highly recommend, actually the 2 that I would highly recommend picking up a copy of, if you're concerned or interested in how this spiritual perspective can help animals through her systematizing of her thinking, would be The 10 Trusts with Mark Beckoff. Many of you may know Mark Beckoff for his work with dogs and his, I don't know, 45 books now or something. Mark is constantly writing, but he helped kind of systematize that, and he's been deeply involved with Jane and the Jane Goodall Institute for decades. And the other one is that very interesting little book, A Prayer for World Peace from 2015. It's beautifully illustrated. It has just a little bit of text on each page. And I think if you were attracted to this presentation because of the link between science and spirituality, I think you can learn a lot about the way she thought and also the way this might impact our meditation, our spiritual perspective, our prayer, different ways of doing that is through that book. It's written pretty interfaithy. And so I think it's pretty accessible for a wide range of views. Okay. All right. So we are coming up on the end of our time together. I hope you enjoyed the lecture portion of this tonight and what I have learned so far. I really appreciated the questions that you all asked to deepen and to send me back into all of that text again with some additional questions to take a look at, to think more deeply about what you've offered. I hope that you will consider joining us at another Compassion Consortium event. We'll tell you just a little bit about those, and then we'll do our closing blessing for Jane. So let me get back here to where I need to be in my slides, which is over here. Zoom be slippery on me today. All right. So if you enjoyed this offering today that I have given of my time and that Marshall has given of her time, if you feel like donating to the work that we do at the Compassion Consortium, all of us on the spiritual team here volunteer our time for these type of events. However, we do have expenses for things like Zoom fees and YouTube costs and things like that to make sure we're getting the word out to people. So we appreciate that. Here is a link. No amount is too small. Skip a latte and help animals over here. You can join us for all sorts of different things that we do. We have a monthly Sunday service that's interfaith. We have all sorts of interesting speakers that come to that and talk with us. We highlight the arguments for multi-species justice through the world's wisdom traditions. We teach all sorts of interspecies spiritual practices, which are on our YouTube page. We do all sorts of advocacy. We have vegan meditation groups. We have a pet law support group or animal companion support group. And we also train animal chaplains. I see a couple of them here in our audience today and that have interacted with us here. We train animal chaplains to support animals and humans through their joys and their challenges in life. And you can learn more about that on our website at compassionconsortium.org as well. So, a blessing for Jane Goodall in the Bardo. Again, the Bardo is an idea from Buddhist teachings that suggest for at least 7 weeks or 49 days after a person's bodily death, this transition from that state to whatever is next, as I like to say it, the deceased still has ties to our world. Their consciousness may still be aware or receptive in some subtle way. So when we offer words, we offer blessings, we offer prayers, we offer thoughts, we dedicate the merit of our time together. That would be Buddhist language, dedicating the merit of our time together, which I do today, to help Jane possibly reach liberation rather than being reborn into the cycle of samsara, of suffering. So if you're willing to, just take a deep breath with me. And as I offer these closing words, feel free to substitute any that don't ring true for you and work better with your own philosophical, spiritual, or cosmological viewpoint. Beloved Jane Goodall, wise friend to this earth, may your journey through the Bardo be clear and untroubled. May every breath of your life's compassion rise now as a lantern before you, lighting the path of peace. May the great forests that you loved so well welcome you with open roots and sheltering leaves. May the chimpanzees you honored as kin recognize your spirit and walk beside you as guardians and joyful witnesses to your transition. If any fear arises, may courage and kindness surround you. If any sorrow lingers for you, may it be met by the boundless love you offered so many beings. May the earth hold you gently. May any ancestors greet you with grace. May your mind be clear and your heart unbound, and your journey guided by the wisdom that you taught us, that reverence is a bridge and that hope is a duty. Beloved Jane, may you know rest and liberation and unending love. May you travel safely through this tender threshold to whatever is next. And may all beings be blessed by the goodness you carried into the world. We dedicate the merit of our time together to the alleviation of suffering and to your transition. May all be free from pain. May all be free from suffering. May all be happy, joyous, and free. Amen, Ashe, and so it is. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Whatever your closing word is in your tradition, or just thanks, can also be a really great ending to a blessing. I really appreciated my time with you here today. Very much appreciate Reverend Marshall Hammer, who was out in the forest doing tech for us today, and to all of you for your time. Have a great night. Until our paths cross again, to be continued.